It all begins with a girl and a painting. Lily is just 12, the daughter of a housemaid. I know this boy. He lived with me at the orphanage. His name was Ben. That one sentence shatters 5 years of silence, grief, and unanswered questions. Because the boy in the painting, that's Ethan Whitmore. The younger brother James thought he'd lost forever. What starts as a child's memory sparks a journey across lies, lost names, and a reunion no one believed possible. Stay with us, because sometimes it takes the truth of a child to reopen a door that was never truly closed. Lily Thompson had never been inside a house that large before, but she moved through the front hall with the ease of someone who belonged. Her mother, Margaret, had worked for the Whitmores for over 15 years, and Lily had spent many afternoons waiting quietly while her mother finished her chores. This time, however, she wasn't reading on the couch or sketching in her notebook. Her steps slowed as her gaze caught the painting that dominated the entryway, a portrait of a boy, maybe 8 years old, his expression calm but oddly distant, as if someone had painted him halfway through a thought. Lily's backpack slid off her shoulder and hit the floor with a dull thud. "Mom," she murmured, though Margaret was still upstairs. The boy's eyes, grey with a hint of blue, were too familiar. She took a step closer, lips parting, her voice barely audible. "He lived with me at the orphanage. His name was Ben." From the staircase above, James Whitmore had been reviewing emails on his phone, half listening to the faint sound of Lily's footsteps. He looked up at the moment her words broke the stillness. For a split second, he thought he'd misheard, that his exhausted mind was playing tricks again. But the way she said it, the certainty, the quiet conviction, made him freeze. Slowly he descended, phone forgotten in his hand. "What did you say?" he asked, his tone sharper than intended. Lily turned, startled, clutching the strap of her backpack like a shield. "I said, that boy, I knew him. He was at St. Mary's Home for Children. We called him Ben." James's throat went dry. He glanced at the portrait again, the painted smile of a boy he'd been mourning for half a decade. "That's not possible," he whispered, though the words lacked strength, conviction. Lily tilted her head, confused but certain. "It's him, Mr. Whitmore. He played piano. He said he had a brother who played with him once, but he didn't know where he went." Margaret appeared then, alarmed by the tension in the air. "Lily, don't bother Mr. Whitmore," she said quickly, sensing something fragile in the room that shouldn't be disturbed. But James didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the girl, as if she were speaking a truth no adult had dared to. "How do you know him?" he demanded. Margaret stepped between them. "Sir, please, she's a child. She makes up stories." "Do I?" Lily protested, her voice rising. "He was my friend. He used to draw pictures of a big house and a man who looked just like you." James flinched. The echo of a half-buried memory, Ethan sketching their father's study, the piano by the window, surfaced with stunning clarity. For years, James had trained himself not to imagine where his brother might be. Now, a child's words were pulling that dam apart, brick by brick. He asked Lily to describe the boy again. She spoke slowly, cautiously, as if sensing that each detail mattered more than she understood. He liked music. Sometimes he'd play on this old, broken keyboard the nuns kept in the rec room, and when the power went out, he'd hum instead. He said music helped him remember things. He never talked about his parents, but once he said he missed his brother and that he used to wear a bracelet with colored beads. James's hand clenched involuntarily. He still had that bracelet, tucked in a drawer upstairs. He couldn't breathe for a moment. Margaret's face had gone pale. "Lily," she said softly, "maybe you're confusing him with another boy." "No, Mom," the girl insisted, shaking her head. "He had the same eyes, the same way of smiling, but like he was hiding something sad." For a long moment, James said nothing. He looked back at the portrait, at the boy he'd lost to an open gate, a crowd, and 5 unending years of silence. "His name isn't Ben," he said finally, voice barely above a whisper. "It's Ethan. Ethan Whitmore." Lily frowned. "Maybe he changed it," she suggested simply, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Her innocence hurt more than any accusation. James felt something unfamiliar stir, a fragile, dangerous thing called hope. It was absurd, impossible, reckless to believe. But the tremor in his chest, the faint sense that the world had just tilted back toward meaning, wouldn't go away. As the silence thickened again, Margaret guided Lily toward the kitchen, murmuring apologies. James remained by the portrait, every thought warring between denial and a desperate need to believe. Lily glanced over her shoulder once more, eyes lingering on the boy's painted face. "He's alive," she said softly, as if to herself. James didn't answer. He couldn't. The words had pierced too deep. When the door to the kitchen closed, he lifted his hand, tracing the edge of the frame with his fingers. The paint felt colder than he remembered. And for the first time in 5 years, the stillness of the house seemed to breathe. What if the impossible wasn't impossible at all? What if, somewhere, the boy in the portrait had grown up calling himself Ben and was still waiting to be found? Dinner was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in rather than soothes. James sat at the head of the table, his fork untouched beside his plate, while Margaret ladled stew into Lily's bowl. Lily hummed softly to herself, unaware, or perhaps uninterested, in the storm that her innocent comment had stirred just hours before. Margaret cleared her throat as she returned to the table, glancing at James with a practiced calm. "She has a vivid imagination, you know. Always has," she said gently. "Sometimes she gets things mixed up. Stories, faces. It's not uncommon at that age." But James didn't respond. He wasn't even looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the dark grain of the table, as though searching for something he'd lost there. Finally, he spoke, voice low but steady. She said his name was Ben, and that he played the piano, that he cried after playing. His tone wasn't accusatory, it was haunted. Margaret softened. There were many children at that orphanage. Maybe she knew someone who resembled... She hesitated. "James, she's just a child." But the name lingered in his mind like a thread tugging at a sealed door. Ben, a name that didn't belong, and yet somehow made everything unravel. Later that night, after Lily had gone to bed and Margaret was quietly tidying up in the kitchen, James retreated to his office. He hadn't set foot there in months, not since the last fruitless meeting with the private investigator he'd hired in desperation. The lights flickered on automatically, revealing stacks of file boxes, old newspaper clippings, and dust-coated memories no one dared to disturb anymore. He sat at the large oak desk, opened the bottom drawer, and reached for the small wooden box that only he knew was there. Inside were the artifacts of a childhood interrupted, Ethan's favorite green marble, a photograph of the two of them at the lake, and a tiny bracelet made of red, white, and blue beads. James held the bracelet between his fingers, his hand trembling. Ethan used to wear it every day, even to bed. James had made one to match, but his had broken the day Ethan vanished. He remembered the way Ethan would press his fingers on the piano keys, not always playing notes, just testing sound like he was searching for something deeper. He played songs that made him cry, Lily had said. And just like that, James remembered the tune, half finished, half invented, that Ethan had written but never completed. The memory was too sharp to be coincidence. James reached for another envelope in the box, unfolding the wrinkled sheet inside, a copy of the original missing persons report. Ethan Whitmore, age 8. Last seen, public park, 3:10 p.m., it read. Underneath was a sketch James had done himself, the last image he remembered of Ethan. Small frame, messy blonde hair, and eyes that always looked like they were wondering something. He remembered the hours spent combing the city, plastering that sketch on light poles, gas stations, grocery stores. The silence that followed, the slow drip of leads that went nowhere, and finally, the words no one wanted to say but everyone began to believe. Maybe he's gone. James never stopped blaming himself. He had looked away for 1 minute. One. He folded the report and placed it back, then opened the slim black binder labeled simply, Ethan. Inside, there were more than 100 pages of leads, tips and photographs that had once given him hope. Now, they were ghosts in a file. But tonight, one detail stood out above the rest. Ben. That name had never appeared, it didn't belong, and yet it might be the key. James pushed back from the desk and stared at the bookshelf, where a thin green folder stuck out unevenly. He pulled it down and flipped through its contents, notes from a private investigator he'd fired 4 years ago. One name jumped out, Teresa Holloway, a nurse. A woman who had been flagged in an unrelated adoption case, but never formally charged. She died 3 years prior, apparently from a drug overdose. She had no listed children, but there had been suspicion about an undocumented boy living with her. No one had followed through. James closed the folder slowly, his heart pounding. What if the system had buried his brother? What if someone had thought they were doing a kindness by stealing him, hiding him? And what if now of all times, Lily's small, unshakable memory was the first honest crack in years of institutional silence and emotional denial? James leaned back in his chair, exhaustion bearing down on him like lead. He wasn't ready to hope, but he wasn't ready to bury the name either. Ben. A name out of nowhere, and yet a name that suddenly felt heavier than all the others combined. For a moment, he simply sat in the dark, the weight of the folder in his lap, his breath shallow. He remembered the promise he'd made to his mother before she died, that he'd keep looking no matter how long it took. He hadn't kept that promise. Not really. He'd stopped digging, stopped believing. Let the pain calcify into routine, into numbness. But tonight, Lily's words had undone something inside him. The idea that Ethan might still be out there, living under another name, abandoned all over again after someone else's mistake. It felt unbearable. He couldn't let that be the truth. He wouldn't. And if there was even a 1% chance, no, even less, he had to follow it, even if it shattered him, even if it led nowhere. He reached for his phone and hesitated, then scrolled until he found the number. Alan Greer. He hadn't spoken to the man in nearly 4 years. Last time they talked, Alan had closed the file and said, "You need to let the boy go." James never forgave him for that, but now he needed him more than ever. He stared at the screen for a long time, thumb hovering over the call button. Finally, with a sharp exhale, he pressed it. 2 rings, 3. Then a voice, older and rougher than he remembered. Greer. James swallowed hard. It's Whitmore. There was a pause. James? Jesus. I didn't think. I need to ask you something, James cut in, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. You once told me he was probably gone, that maybe he was dead. Another pause. Longer this time. Yeah, I remember. James closed his eyes. But what if he's not? What if Ethan is alive, and I've just been looking in the wrong place? The silence on the other end stretched thin, like something ready to break. Then, slowly, Alan said, "Tell me everything." The road to the abandoned orphanage wasn't long, but it may as well have been a lifetime for James. He didn't speak much during the drive, and Lily, usually chatty and full of curious questions, stayed quiet, hugging the sketchbook she'd brought along as if it were a part of her. It had been years since she last saw Ben, but she remembered him clearly. More than anyone else at St. Mary's, he had been kind. Quiet, yes, and hard to reach. But he'd once drawn a picture of her with butterfly wings and taped it to her bunk. That meant something. And now she carried the last few drawings he gave her in a worn notebook covered in stickers. She flipped through the pages carefully as they pulled up to the crumbling building. "He told me once that he used to draw with his brother," she said, her voice soft but steady. "He didn't remember his name, just said they had matching bracelets and made up piano songs." James looked at her, not blinking. "He said that?" She nodded, then held out one of the drawings. 2 boys at a piano, one older, one younger. It wasn't just a memory now, it was a trail. Inside the orphanage, the air was dry and lifeless, the kind of dead silence James had grown used to. But what he wasn't used to was this feeling, like something unspeakably important had been left behind, and no one had noticed until now. They moved slowly through the halls, James scanning every hallway for any trace of his brother's presence, any artifact that might anchor the impossible to the real. Lily led them with surprising confidence, as if some internal compass was guiding her. "We used to sit here," she said, pointing to a corner by a dusty radiator. "He'd draw, I'd make up stories. He didn't like the other kids much." James could picture it now, a boy alone in a crowd, trying to remember things that wouldn't stay. In the old office, papers still littered the floor, filing cabinets rusted shut, drawers jammed from years of disuse. James pulled one open, forcing it until the metal screeched. Inside were soggy folders, names smudged, ink blurred, worthless almost. But Lily crouched and started digging. "You have to look at the backs," she said. "Sometimes they wrote stuff there, like notes." It was exactly what someone told her once. When no one wants a child, even their history ends up scribbled in margins. After nearly an hour of clawing through decay, Lily gasped. "Here," she said, holding up a folder. The label read, "Ben Holloway." James took it, his fingers trembling. The sheet inside was thin, half-burned at one corner, but the writing was legible. No birth certificate, no intake record, no parents listed, just a date of arrival, a few behavioral notes, and a barely legible signature under guardian. Teresa Holloway. The same name from the flagged adoption lead he had dismissed 3 years earlier. Dismissed because there was no follow-up, no way to verify it. "She's dead now," he said aloud, not meaning to. "Overdose 3 years ago." Lily stood beside him, watching his face closely. He didn't talk about her much, just said she was sick a lot, that he had to hide when the lights went out. James tried to process it all, but the details were grinding against each other. Why hadn't anyone checked this? Why hadn't he? The name had passed through his hands before, buried in a report, dismissed as unrelated. And now, here it was again, holding the weight of everything he'd lost. It wasn't just a name, it was a direction, and directions mattered when you were chasing ghosts. James turned the page. There was nothing else, no forwarding information, no mention of where Ben had gone, just a final note in red pen. Child left premises, presumed runaway, no recovery attempt made. James stared at it for a long time, unable to move. No one had even looked for him. The system hadn't just failed Ethan, it had erased him. He set the folder down and leaned against the broken desk, breath shallow, rage rising. "They didn't even try," he said, more to himself than anyone. "They just let him vanish." Lily, quiet beside him, said something he hadn't expected. "He came back once." James turned. "What?" "He came back months after he ran. I saw him from the window. He stood by the tree near the gates, just staring. I called for Sister Agnes, but when she came, he was gone." James ran a hand through his hair, stunned. "You never told anyone?" "No one believed me," Lily replied. "They thought I made him up, that I missed him too much. Maybe I did, but I know what I saw." James's jaw tightened. He wasn't sure what hurt more. The idea of Ethan coming back and finding no one waiting, or the idea that a little girl had carried that truth alone for so long. They stayed longer than they'd planned, rifling through every cabinet and dusty drawer, but there was nothing else, just the echo of what had once been a life, reduced to a pseudonym and a burned file. Still, the name was there. Ben Holloway. It was more than he had before. James tucked the folder under his arm and looked at Lily, who stood now with her arms crossed, watching him like she wasn't sure if he was going to cry or break something. He did neither. "Let's go," he said. But as they stepped out, he paused at the door, turning back to glance once more at the dim, cracked hall behind them. Somewhere along these corridors, his brother had walked, drawn, maybe even laughed. It wasn't a place anymore. It was a timeline, a missed opportunity. And yet, for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like a beginning. He'd found a name, a thread, a face. Teresa Holloway, Ben, the boy who played piano and cried after. Maybe now, he was close enough that retreat wasn't an option. Maybe now, he was too close to turn back. The lead had come from a woodworker in a small town outside Burlington. An offhand remark in a local Facebook group. "That piano kid was here again, the one with the red hat. Plays like he's possessed." James had read it 5 times before acting. Most tips were dead ends, misidentifications or cruel jokes, but something about that comment, "piano kid, red hat," hit too many strange notes at once. And so he drove, alone, without telling Margaret or Lily, clinging to the one word that had never let go of him: Ben. He arrived in the middle of a Saturday fair, the kind that bloomed with families and laughter, food trucks and folding chairs. But he wasn't looking for any of that. He moved through the crowds with quiet urgency, scanning for a keyboard, for the rhythm of notes. Then in a clearing near a coffee stall he heard it. The music didn't sound polished. It sounded remembered. Broken pieces of something beautiful, stitched together in a way only children do when they invent their own song. James's body locked. He knew those notes. They were his, theirs. A melody he and Ethan had made up one summer afternoon, laughing at how wrong it sounded. But now it sounded like a prayer. He didn't rush forward. Instead, he stood still, hiding behind the edge of a vendor's tent, barely breathing. The boy was sitting on an old folding stool, hunched over a keyboard that had seen better years. His fingers moved fast, not flawlessly, but with a kind of instinct that made it impossible to look away. And then James saw it, the red knit cap pulled low over his ears, almost hiding his face. The coat was too big, the shoes worn, but the boy's hands were Ethan's, his profile, the shape of his shoulders, and the way he paused every now and then between measures, like waiting for something familiar to catch up to him. People dropped coins into a battered case. He nodded but didn't speak. His eyes scanned the crowd without really seeing. James's chest tightened. There was no rational explanation to be had here. He knew what he was seeing. Ethan was alive, in front of him, not a memory, not a dream, but breathing, moving, playing. He fought back every impulse to call out his name, to run and take him into his arms. But he didn't. Something in him warned that this moment wasn't about recognition, it was about understanding. When the song ended, there wasn't applause, just polite clapping and the rustle of distracted passers-by. The boy didn't smile. He looked down at his hands as if unsure whether they'd betrayed him by playing something he didn't fully remember. James stepped forward a few feet but kept his distance. He watched as the boy bent to collect the coins, arranging them by type in a tin. Then he opened a small leather notebook and made a mark. James saw sketches on the corner of the page. Quick, frantic doodles of a piano, a boy, a tree. He had always drawn trees like that, lopsided and shadow-heavy. James took one more step forward, and something in the boy's posture stiffened. He turned his head slightly, alert now. James froze. Their eyes met. Just for a second, and James felt it. Confusion, fear, familiarity. It was like watching someone wake up from a long dream and not knowing which world was real. The boy's gaze didn't soften. He didn't speak. But he didn't look away either. James opened his mouth, then closed it. The name caught in his throat. Saying Ethan would only push him further into the fog. And that couldn't happen, not yet. Instead, James knelt slowly and unzipped his coat pocket. Inside was the envelope he'd carried every day since the visit to the orphanage. A single sheet of paper inside, a melody written by Ethan's own hand back when he was 8. James unfolded it carefully, hands steady despite the storm in his chest. He stepped closer to the keyboard case, where a few bills and coins glinted. The boy's eyes tracked every movement. James didn't speak. He didn't need to. Gently, he placed the folded paper inside the case between $2 bills, angled just enough to be noticed, but not enough to draw attention from anyone else. Then he stood, met the boy's eyes again, and nodded. No tears, no questions, just a silent offer. The boy blinked, confused, then looked down at the paper. He didn't reach for it, not yet. James turned and walked away before he could see what the boy would do. Every instinct screamed at him to stay, but this wasn't a moment for forcing anything. It had taken 5 years to get this close. One more day wouldn't kill him. One wrong word might. Behind him, the sounds of the fair resumed, loud and thoughtless. But James wasn't listening anymore. He walked past food vendors and couples and strollers without seeing any of them. His mind was filled with Ethan's face, older but still his. The shock hadn't worn off. He felt cracked open, flooded with both guilt and something dangerously close to hope. All this time, he'd feared the worst. He'd pictured graves, headlines, cold case files collecting dust. But now he had seen Ethan alive, not just surviving, but holding on in his own way. The boy hadn't known him. Not fully, but something had flickered in that look, something that said, "I don't know you, but I've seen you before." James kept walking until the fair was behind him. Then he stopped, turned around once, and stared back through the trees. He couldn't see the boy anymore. But he hoped, he needed to believe, that the music hadn't ended. Back at the car, James sat for a long time without turning the key. The folded duplicate of the paper he'd left behind was still in the glove box. He opened it again. The melody they'd created as boys was simple, silly even, but there was something in it that Ethan had always loved. Maybe he would recognize it. Maybe he already had. The boy's face haunted him now, not in the way Ethan had haunted his dreams all these years, but in the way that memory knocks when it's trying to come home. There was no guarantee that Ethan would play it. No certainty that he would even open the paper, but James had left it anyway. That was the only thing he could do, the only thing that felt right. As he finally started the engine and pulled away, the image remained burned in his mind. A boy in a red hat, hunched over a broken keyboard, fingers moving like he was building something that had once been broken. He hadn't said a word, but James had heard everything. And when the music had stopped, James hadn't needed to see the boy's face to know. Ben was Ethan. Ben returned to the fair the next morning like he always did, but something in him had shifted. His fingers hesitated where they normally glided. He still played the same songs, fragments of melodies he'd stitched together over the years, but they no longer felt like a shield. They felt exposed, uncertain, and he noticed for the first time the strange paper in the keyboard case. It hadn't been there before. At first he thought it was just a tip or a note from a kind stranger, but when he picked it up and unfolded it, something electric moved through him. It wasn't just a song. It was his song, not one he'd learned or copied. This was the one he and someone else had made up long ago. The notes were written in a childish hand, the letters rounded, uneven. But he recognized the rhythm immediately. His heart started pounding. He glanced up, scanning the crowd, but no one seemed familiar. He looked back at the paper, and then, without quite knowing why, he began to play it. The first few notes came uncertain, like stones skipping across unfamiliar water, but as his fingers found the pattern, something in him responded. Not his memory, at least not at first, but something more instinctual, a feeling, as if this melody had been waiting in his bones to be awakened. He closed his eyes, the rest of the world disappeared, And then the flashes came. Not hallucinations, not dreams. Flashes. A swing set creaking in the wind. A soft voice calling a name. Ethan. Hands over his on the piano, guiding him through the last few notes of a song. Laughter. Not a stranger's, but his own, smaller and higher pitched. He gasped and stumbled, his fingers halting mid-key. The rush of memory hit like a wave he hadn't braced for. He grabbed the edge of the keyboard to steady himself. People were watching now, but he didn't care. His breathing was ragged, his vision blurry, and the name echoed in his mind again. Ethan. Was that his name? Was that who he had been? Panic overtook clarity. He slammed the keyboard case shut, shoved the paper into his coat and ran. Through the vendors, past the coffee carts, ducking into an alley where he crouched behind crates of produce and tried to breathe. His hands trembled. The memory hadn't come with warmth or relief. It came with terror, the terror of not knowing who you are, but sensing that someone else does, and that they're watching. He stayed hidden for hours, knees pressed to his chest, fingers pressed to his temples. At some point, the sun began to set, and with it, the noise of the fair faded. He felt like something in him had split open, and no matter how tightly he wrapped his coat around him, it wouldn't close again. When he finally returned to the small shelter room where he slept, an abandoned van parked behind a closed-down diner, he didn't unpack his keyboard. He just lay down staring at the ceiling, the paper still in his pocket, burning like a secret he hadn't agreed to carry. The following evening he didn't plan to go back, but something drew him there anyway. The fair was quieter now, fewer people, less color. He didn't set up the keyboard, just stood in the same spot, arms crossed, scanning the area like someone looking for a ghost. That's when he saw them. The older woman first, grey hair pulled back, a paper bag in one arm, then the girl, his age, maybe younger, with wide, wary eyes and a cautious kind of energy. They didn't approach him right away. They just sat on a bench nearby. It took him several minutes to realize they weren't selling anything or waiting for anyone. They were waiting for him. He finally stepped forward, slowly, cautiously. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice didn't sound like his own. It sounded smaller. Margaret gave a soft smile, said only, "We're not here to bother you." Lily didn't say anything at first, just looked at him like she was trying to read him. He looked away, swallowing hard. "That man," Ben finally asked, "the one who left the paper, does he know me?" His voice cracked on the last word. Margaret hesitated, but Lily didn't. She stepped forward, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her hoodie. "Yeah," she said quietly. "He does." Ben studied her, distrust shadowing his face. "How? Why?" He was ready to bolt again, but she didn't push. She just sat down on the sidewalk curb and shrugged. "He's been looking for you, not just for a day or a week, for a long time. He didn't know where to look, but he never stopped trying." Ben frowned, trying to make sense of it. "Who is he?" Lily looked down at her shoes. "Your brother." The word made something twist in his chest. He wanted to laugh, deny it, run, but instead he sat beside her. "Why didn't he come talk to me?" Lily smiled, but it was a sad, knowing smile. "Because sometimes, when someone's been missing you for too long, they get scared they'll ruin everything if they say the wrong thing." Ben stared ahead, the fair lights flickering in his peripheral vision. For the first time in years, something inside him wasn't just surviving, it was listening. As the three of them sat there in a silence that didn't feel empty, Ben slowly pulled the folded paper from his coat pocket. He opened it again, stared at the notes, then looked up. "He really waited?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Lily nodded. "Every day," she said, finally meeting his eyes. "He just didn't know where to find you." Ben didn't respond right away, but he didn't turn away either. The words, like the melody, found space inside him and stayed there. He didn't know what came next. He didn't know if he believed everything yet. But for the first time, he believed enough to ask the question, a small, trembling question from a boy whose whole life had been shaped by what he didn't know. That man, he really knows me. And Lily, her voice steady despite the emotion in her chest, replied with the only truth she had. He waited for you every single day. He just didn't know where to look. James didn't try to bring Ethan back into his life with speeches or demands. That would have been the old version of him, the man who once believed that control could mend what grief had broken. This time, he did something different. He found a small, weathered house to rent just 3 blocks from the square, a place with no grand intentions, no pictures on the walls, no expectations. He told no one he was there except Margaret and Lily. Most days, he simply walked to the bench by the plaza, where Ben often sat sketching and left things behind, a book of illustrated fairy tales, a comic about 2 brothers traveling through time, a tin of sharpened colored pencils. He never waited around to be seen. And yet, from behind windows, from alley corners, from cafe booths, Ben watched him, noticed the offerings. He never touched them while James was near, but the next morning, the items were always gone. The pattern became ritual. One man waited without asking. One boy approached without promising. And slowly, very slowly, curiosity began to override fear. It was Lily who first said aloud what James suspected. He doesn't think he's allowed to want you back. That line echoed in James's head for days. He realized Ben needed more than answers. He needed permission. Permission to exist in someone's life again without having to explain all the missing years. So James kept leaving things. A note in a library book. I used to draw with someone who drew trees like yours. A prepaid hot chocolate at the diner with "For the boy in the red hat" scribbled on the cup. There was never a reply, but there were signs. One day the hot chocolate cup was found with a sketch of a tree drawn on it, taped to the bench. Another day, the book James left had been annotated in blue pen, with one word circled: home. The exchanges weren't loud or obvious. They were small, deliberate, private, but for James, each was a note in a melody he was starting to recognize again. And then, one afternoon, Ben walked into the public library. James had been there already, speaking quietly with the librarian about reserving time at the grand piano tucked into a corner reading room. He didn't expect Ben to show up. But there he was, red cap tucked into his jacket pocket, sketchbook under one arm, eyes darting. He didn't speak to James, just stood near the piano, watching. James, heart thudding, said nothing. He opened the lid, sat down, and began to play the same unfinished melody, the one they had invented all those years ago. It wasn't perfect. He forgot the timing at one point. His hands shook, but he played anyway. Ben didn't interrupt. Instead, after a moment, he stepped forward, slid onto the bench beside James, and placed his hands over the lower keys. Without a word, he picked up where James had left off. The notes weren't flawless, but they were familiar. Their shared language had returned, not with words, but through sound. Neither of them looked at the other, but they played as if they had never stopped. When the final note settled, they didn't speak right away. James slowly closed the lid, uncertain whether to hold his breath or exhale. Ben sat still, hands on his knees. Finally, he said, "You played it wrong." In the middle. James gave a small smile. "I was waiting for someone to correct me." Ben looked at him sideways. "I don't remember everything." "You don't have to," James replied. "You remember enough." Ben didn't answer, but the silence between them had changed shape. It wasn't defensive anymore. It was thoughtful. James stood, stepped back, giving Ben space. "I'll come here again, same time next week," he said. Ben just nodded, and that was enough. That one nod was more progress than all the years of searching had ever given him. In the days that followed, they met again, Twice at the library, once at the diner where James didn't sit at the same table, just nearby, sipping coffee while Ben worked through a crossword. Eventually, words came, halting at first, then more fluid. "Did I have a dog?" "Yeah, Cody." "You named him after a cartoon." "Did I draw a pirate map?" "You hid it in the basement and told me it led to buried treasure." "Was it real?" "You made me dig through 4 boxes of laundry to find it." "So, no." They laughed. Awkward, uncertain laughter, but laughter all the same. Each memory recovered wasn't just a thread, it was a crack in the wall Ben had built to keep himself safe. And through those cracks, the light of their shared past began to seep in. Not everything was clear, not everything was comfortable, but what mattered was beginning to emerge. They had once been two, and maybe they could be again. The third time they sat at the piano together, James didn't bring sheet music. Instead, he asked, "Want to make something up?" Ben hesitated, then nodded. They played slowly, clumsily, but with real joy. And for the first time, James noticed the boy smiling, fully, not just with politeness, but with memory. He was still fragile, still sorting through the puzzle of who he'd been and who he'd become. But now he wasn't doing it alone. They were sitting in the same place, sharing the same notes, and listening for the echoes that only made sense when they played them together. In that moment, James understood. Healing wasn't about returning to what was, but building something new from what remained. And just like that, every fragmented memory, every smell, every name, every pirate map became a crack in the wall that had kept them apart. It was Ben who asked first, "Can I see where you lived?" The question startled James more than any declaration of memory could have. For weeks he had waited, never daring to suggest the visit himself, fearing it would feel like claiming ownership over someone who had fought so hard to belong nowhere. But now the request came simply, quietly, from Ben, and James only nodded. They drove in silence to the mansion on the hill, a place that once held every version of their laughter and loss. When they reached the gate, Ben hesitated, then stepped forward as if his body already knew the way. He didn't ask where to go. He moved through the corridors like someone tracing lines he couldn't see, but somehow remembered. James followed a few paces behind, letting him lead, afraid to interrupt what felt like a fragile dialogue between the boy and the house itself. Ben climbed the staircase and turned left without thinking. The hall stretched long and familiar. He stopped outside a door with chipped paint, his hand hovering over the knob. When he pushed it open, dust rose from years of neglect, but that didn't matter. The small bed, the window overlooking the garden, the shelf lined with forgotten toys, all of it was his map. He crossed to the dresser, opened the top drawer, and froze. Inside lay a small wooden box. He lifted the lid and found a bracelet of colored beads, faded but intact. "I made this," he murmured. His voice cracked. "I remember. My brother made one too." James swallowed hard, forcing steadiness into his tone. "You never took it off," he said softly. Ben rubbed the beads between his fingers, the rhythm of a memory coming alive in his hands. "I thought it broke," he whispered. "The other one did," James answered. "Mine." They walked next to the study. The room felt larger than Ben expected, the shelves looming like sentinels of a life paused mid-sentence. He stopped when his eyes caught the painting on the far wall, the portrait of a young boy smiling faintly, a piano behind him. Ben tilted his head, studying it. "He looks like me," he said slowly, "but he's someone else." James stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's you, and he always was." Ben shook his head, almost frightened. "No, that can't be me. That kid looks like he belongs somewhere." James wanted to tell him that belonging wasn't about walls or names, but about being seen, about being wanted. But he couldn't find words that wouldn't break the moment. Instead, he said simply, "You still do." For a long time they stood there, the portrait watching both of them, past and present overlapping, until it was impossible to tell which boy had been lost and which had finally come home. Afterward, James went to his desk and unlocked a drawer he hadn't touched since the day the police had closed the case. He pulled out a thin envelope and placed it on the table. His hands trembled as he slid its contents toward Ben. "These are yours," he said. Inside were the original birth certificate, Ethan James Whitmore, age 8 when missing, the documented evidence of the illegal adoption, and a letter written in slanted handwriting, signed Teresa Holloway. Ben stared at the papers, his breath caught between disbelief and recognition. James spoke gently, each word measured. "She wasn't all bad. She thought she was saving you, but she broke the law, and she broke us." Ben opened the letter, reading in silence. Teresa's words were simple, almost apologetic. "I tried to give him peace. Tell him someday he'll understand why I couldn't stay." When he finished, he didn't speak. He just pressed the page to his chest as tears slid down his face, soundless, unguarded, the kind that carried years of confusion without anger. They spent hours after that talking, not about the documents, but about smaller things. About the dog named Cody, the pirate stories in the basement, the way their mother used to hum while baking. Each recollection felt like a bridge being rebuilt plank by plank. At one point, Ben asked, "Why did you keep looking for me?" James gave a faint, exhausted smile. "Because you're my brother, and because stopping would have meant admitting I lost you twice." Ben wiped his face, nodding slowly. "I didn't think anyone was coming." "You were wrong," James said simply. "I just didn't know where to start." The honesty between them felt raw, imperfect but real. For the first time since the fair, Ben didn't look away when James met his gaze. Something had shifted. Not forgiveness yet, but recognition. The truth had weight, but it was a kind of weight that grounded rather than crushed. As the afternoon light faded, James started to gather the papers, but Ben stopped him. "Can I keep them?" he asked quietly. "They're yours," James said. "They've always been." Ben nodded, then looked around the study one more time, the walls lined with books, the portrait, the desk, the traces of a life he'd once belonged to. He asked for a notebook and a pen. James handed them over without question. Ben sat down, opened to a blank page, and for a long moment didn't move. Then he began to write, slowly, deliberately, the words large and steady across the paper. When he finished, he turned the notebook toward James. In clear, firm letters it read, "My name is Ethan Whitmore." And in that single line, years of silence finally had a voice. Months had passed, but the ceremony felt like the final note of a song that had taken years to compose. The Whitmore Foundation for Missing and Forgotten Children stood not as a monument to grief, but as a promise carved out of pain, that no child would ever again disappear into the system without someone looking for them. James hadn't wanted his name on the front signage, but Ethan insisted. "You searched for me," he said. "That should mean something." So it did. The doors opened that morning to press, supporters, social workers, and volunteers, but the moment didn't truly begin until Ethan stood beside James in the main hall, his hands clasped, head bowed, as the guests entered the room with the small grand piano at the center. He wore a simple button-down and a bracelet of red, white, and blue beads on his wrist, restored, rethreaded, but the same. No introduction was needed. Everyone knew who he was. The boy who had been lost. The boy who had returned. The logo was his. Ethan had drawn it in his sketchbook during one of his quieter afternoons at James's rented house. Two boys at a piano, one older, one younger, their backs slightly arched, not performing but sharing, not for an audience but for each other. The detail that struck people most wasn't the piano or the posture, but the way the boys' heads tilted inward, almost touching, as if they were listening to something only they could hear. When it came time to unveil the image, Ethan stepped forward without hesitation. "This is what saved me," he said simply, "being remembered." Lily, seated in the front row, squeezed Margaret's hand when he said it. James, standing just behind him, didn't move. He didn't need to. The weight of Ethan's words, quiet and unscripted, fell into the crowd like light breaking through stained glass. This wasn't about donors or legacy or press coverage. This was about memory, about refusing to let a name slip through the cracks of a forgotten file. The music came next. James had asked only once, weeks earlier, if Ethan would consider playing. "You don't have to," he said. "But if you want to..." Ethan had simply nodded. That was all. And now, here they were. The two of them walked to the piano together. James sat first, hands settling over the keys. Ethan joined beside him, almost touching shoulders. There was no announcement, no speech. James played the opening chords of the melody they'd built from scratch as boys, clumsy, imperfect, beautiful in its uneven rhythm. Ethan followed without hesitation. His timing was natural, his memory solid now, his fingers steady. Their music wasn't meant to impress, it was meant to remember. And the room, packed though it was, faded until only the two of them remained in the center of that quiet miracle. Two boys and one piano. The final note lingered longer than expected, not because they sustained it, but because no one dared to move. Ethan let his hand rest on the keys, even after the sound faded. James glanced sideways, his throat tight with everything he wanted to say, and nothing that could hold it all. Then Ethan leaned in and whispered something only James could hear. "You found me." 3 words, small, almost weightless. And yet, they broke something open in James, something that had hardened into ritual and silence. His voice cracked when he replied, "You forgave me." It was not a question. It was a recognition. Ethan didn't answer with words. He didn't have to. The fact that he sat there shoulder to shoulder with his brother was answer enough. In the front row, Lily dabbed at her eyes with her sleeve, pretending not to cry. Margaret wrapped an arm around her, resting her chin on the girl's head. Around them, no one clapped. Not yet. They were still suspended in the sacred space between loss and return, in the recognition that something rare had just happened, the reclaiming of a bond that had been left for dead and somehow survived. This was not a reunion tied by ceremony or by papers. This was something rebuilt note by note, sketch by sketch, word by word, something chosen. Later there would be applause, there would be articles, there would be pictures and interviews and numbers tallied for donations. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Only the 2 boys mattered. One older, one younger, one who searched and one who waited. As the room finally stirred back to life, Ethan stood, reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. He didn't unfold it. He just held it out to James, who took it with both hands. No one else saw what it was, but James recognized the weight of it, his own sketch of the melody. The one he'd left in a piano case all those months ago. It had made its way back to him, not untouched, but cherished. Ethan gave a small nod, then turned to the audience and smiled, shy but sure. In that simple expression, years of silence were rewritten. And as he stepped back beside James, neither brother said a word. They didn't need to. They had already said everything in the only language that had ever truly belonged to them. We put a lot of heart into bringing stories like this one to life, stories that remind us that even the deepest wounds can lead to unexpected healing. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel. It's your support that helps us keep sharing these powerful journeys with others. We're not just a channel, we're a community that believes in second chances, in quiet strength, and in bonds that go beyond blood. Explore our other videos and don't forget to leave a comment below. We read every one of them with care. Thank you for being here with us.